And I want to thank all of you for your testimony today and really relating to us the difficulties you're all facing with this economic downturn from your states and representing cities and the organizations also that you're representing. I appreciate the very sincere testimony you gave today. Yeah, I do think it's critical that Congress take immediate steps to get the economy back on track. And as Governor Patterson said, in his oral testimony, he'd like to see us lower taxes on business. I think we should be talking about tax relief in this committee for small businesses and families, and we should be talking about ways to protect the investments of seniors, and maybe that's suspending investment taxes or suspending the required forced distributions from 401k plans, and we should be talking about cutting taxes to stimulate growth and investment. Which brings me to my question, Governor Sanford. You have a record of cutting taxes in the state of South Carolina and reducing spending, as you've outlined. And when you reduced taxes, did you create jobs or did you lose jobs in South Carolina?
We gained jobs. We're up roughly 150,000 net jobs from where we started 6 years ago. And so on a net basis, we've positively gained them.
It is rare to hear somebody come to this committee and say, please don't provide me with any more federal money. So I think that may be the reason why you might have received some of the reactions you've gotten today. But your chart that state spending has increased 124% in the last 10 years, federal spending 83% in the last 10 years, and that more money for states might simply just mean more permanent state spending. Given that, is there any flexibility that Congress could provide you with spending over current dollars that the states relieve? And if you have any specifics on the flexibility that you might be able to receive that could be helpful.
That's why I specifically mentioned unfunded mandates. As the mayor just mentioned, the rubber meets the road at the mayoral level, at the county level, and at the state level. And if you look at a number of those different mandates, I think that at the local level, we have a far better grasp of the problem. I think we have a far better sense of how to deal with the problem than, with all due respect, folks in Washington. So I would say you look at the number, $428 million worth of unfunded mandates at the federal level, that frankly would help us a lot more than a stimulus package, just simply freeing us, allowing us more flexibility in how we spend our own money at the state level. I would also say this: what needs to be remembered about contemplated deficits is that it is an eventual rise in taxes. A deficit is simply a deferred tax, because if you believe in the soundness of our dollar and the creditworthiness of the United States, any accumulated deficit simply means that's an accumulated tax. So what some people are saying by saying, well, we'll just increase the deficit to increase a stimulus package, is to say we'll increase taxes. And I don't think you're ever going to grow the economy by ultimately raising taxes.
We've seen in the last 2 years the deficit increased by about 77%, and that doesn't include the rescue package. It could be much higher, doesn't include this potential deficit spending in a stimulus package. So we're seeing a pretty significant increase in the federal budget deficit in just the last couple of years, and that follows 3 years of actually declining annual deficits. You've mentioned the concern there that this may ultimately mean higher taxes down the road, and if we're trying to stimulate the economy and stimulate a pro-growth agenda and economic growth and job creation, how will raising taxes ultimately help do that? And we're hearing this may be on incomes of at least $150,000 if you hear the vice presidential nominee, the Democrat vice presidential nominee, in his recent remarks. What do you think this will do to economic growth in South Carolina?
I think it would hurt it in our state. I think it would hurt it in other states. It's interesting, in conversation about the possibility of $1 trillion deficit this year in Washington, Barney Frank said, I believe later on that there should be tax increases to deal with those deficits. That was his quote. Again, you look at this notion of increasing taxes, I think it has the so-called Laffer curve. I think that the historic example of what's happened with countries around the globe in their different experimentations with tax rates is that if you increase taxes, there will be a drag on the underlying economy. And so that's why I think we ought to pay particular attention on that front. I would also mention the fact that, some of the worthy public works projects that were just mentioned, government at the federal level, I think, is a very inefficient way of getting the dollars there. If you look, for instance, at the band shell, I guess Pete was talking a moment ago about the worst you end up with the band shell, the best you end up with some other infrastructure project that might be more notable. But even in what's talked about with this bill, as I understand it, about $14 billion would go for infrastructure out of a total of $150 billion. So that's $1 in $10 that's actually going to infrastructure. The other important point to remember is that John Macon, who's a noted scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, did a study of the so-called lost decade within Japan. And what Japan tried to do was just that, would put a lot of money into infrastructure and maybe that would get our economy going. That proved not to be the case there in Japan over that 10-year time period.
All right, thank you. I see my time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
So, Mr. McCurry, you said that you thought that Governor Sanford's testimony helped show the basic differences between the two sides here, and Mr. Rango has emphasized we try to bridge them. So I want to try to see if we can bridge this a bit. You were asked about unemployment comp. The question is extending the benefits, which we've done in all previous recessions, and we did once. And a bill passed this House just before we left, 368 to 28, to extend the benefits 7 weeks for those, for everybody, and an additional 13 for those over 6%. I want to be clear. This isn't a new program. You're opposed to what passed the House and is now in the Senate, extending unemployment compensation benefits?
In its present form, because because there's a substantial additional cost of doing so. And I keep going back to my basic premise, which is, by all means, if you want to extend unemployment benefits, but then cut some other area of federal government, I would applaud that effort. That's not what's being contemplated.
Well, except there's money, there are billions and billions of dollars in the trust fund for unemployment comp. And the only reason it's scored is because of the unified budget. So I think your state should understand that you're with the 28 who voted no and opposed to the 368, including many members of this committee on your side.
I would grant you that it's always easy to spend somebody else's money.
It's not somebody else's money.
Whose is it?
It's the money of people who worked for it and the employers paid in for it for the purpose of extending. There are 2 million plus people who have exhausted their benefits, including many thousands in South Carolina.
Oh, absolutely.
It's very sustainable. That trust fund has more than enough money to pay for the extension. And I think it shows the difference between the two parties. I don't think we're blurring the difference. And I want to ask you about the Highway Trust Fund, because you say instead of a bag of money with strings attached. Now, I think you receive ample funds through the highway program. Are you opposed to the federal highway program?
We're a donor state. We send more money to Washington than we receive based on gas tax revenues.
Okay, but I'm glad you raised that. We don't have figures later, at least I don't have right before me, beyond 05, but I think the pattern is clear. This is South Carolina federal tax paid versus federal spending received. Mm-hmm. In 05, South Carolina received $1.35 for every dollar that it paid in federal taxes. Governor Patterson said the opposite is true in New York, and in Michigan we've debated this forever, and now it's up to 94 cents. So you come here and say that you're a donor state in highway funds, but overall you're a donee state. It was in 05 $1.35, and that pattern has been true. The figures go back, I have 1981 when it was $1.21, and then the last years I have for it was $1.34, $1.36, $1.35. So I don't understand even though you're a donor state, how much do you receive back now in highway funds?
I don't have the number at the tip of my tongue. But what I would say is...
Are you opposed to the highway fund, to our highway program?
Yeah, in its present form, because I'll give you a perfect example. The question is in the delivery system itself, and we could debate the merits of, are we a donor versus not a donor state. We could go back and forth on that front. I'd have numbers, you'd have your sets of numbers. But what's interesting is...
And my set of numbers aren't mine.
Right, I understand. But we could come up with different sets of numbers that we could debate on. But even if we just said your numbers are right, I think what's interesting is still the inefficiency in the present model. For instance, Jim Clyburn, who's a member of Congress from there in South Carolina, has proposed a $100 million bridge from Lone Star to Remini.
Oh, but wait,
but in other words, the folks in the Highway Department have said it's not needed. There are a lot of more compelling infrastructure projects in the state based on transportation need and based on traffic counts, and yet to have that road picked from Washington, D.C., I think is at odds with, again, this larger notion that the mayor was just getting at, which is at times local knows best.
Look, Governor, you can pick out one earmark if you want, but the fact remains you come here and you talk about the role of the federal government, you want it diminished. You're a donee state in terms of federal dollars, dramatically so. You have a federal highway program that is of major benefit to your state. You pick out one earmark, and the infrastructure proposal is not to expand, but to use an infrastructure that this country has benefited from. And essentially, I think you do shape, without getting into detail, the issue before the public this year, and that is the role of federal government when times are difficult, when jobs are being lost, when the financial system is under immense pressure. And I just want to close. You talk about the unfunded mandate, and my time has expired. Of the $428 billion, 300, these are your own figures, and $66 billion are in education. They're special ed and No Child Left Behind. Proposals that came through here on a bipartisan basis, but have been underfunded in the last 8 years where the Republicans controlled the Congress. So, and the mandate, the states aren't carrying out 100% special ed in lieu of federal monies. So to lump this all together when more than 3/4 is in education, and the Congress that has been not dominated by the party to which you belong has not funded the mandates, I think you need not to talk about the role of government, but the way certain people within the government have exercised or failed to exercise an appropriate role of government.
Again, I understand what you're saying, but I keep going back to the deeper foundation that I'm getting at, which is we could come up with different programs, some of which we'd find meritorious, some of which we wouldn't. But the bottom line is, at the federal level, it is absolutely unsustainable. We've accumulated $52 trillion worth of unfunded political promises. And either we're going to default on debt, or we're going to raise taxes, or we're going to cut benefits dramatically down the line.
Okay, you're talking to a now majority that has opposed the policies that have added $5 trillion to the debt of this country. You're preaching to the wrong choir.
I'm not preaching it. I'm just saying, here's where we are. I'm not saying it's Democrats' fault. I'm not saying it's a Republican fault. Both folks share some blame in that equation. But I'm saying based on where we are now, can we add another $150 billion worth of debt when we're already $52 trillion in the hole?
Just to set the record straight on special ed funding, IDEA funding, Mr. Levin's gone, but not that it matters, but I was here when Republicans took over the House in 1995, and we increased the level of funding for IDEA. We increased the percent of funding for IDEA when we took the majority.